London, December 1971. The Smithfield Agricultural Show buzzes with the usual crowd of farmers examining the latest Western machinery. But today, something different draws their attention. A red tractor sits in the Soviet pavilion, gleaming under the exhibition lights, the MTZ-50 Belarus. Then they see the price tag, 35% less than a comparable John Deere. In some markets, dealers claimed savings of up to 50%. But even the conservative estimates showed substantial price advantages over any Western competitor. This wasn't just another product launch. This was the opening shot of an economic war. The Soviet Union had weaponized agriculture, turning tractors into instruments of market conquest. The question hanging in the cold London air wasn't whether farmers would be tempted. It was whether free market companies could survive against a state-subsidized assault. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This was détente-era economics in action, where the battleground had shifted from missiles to markets. The command economy operated on a logic that seemed unbeatable. Produce in massive volumes, price below cost, win through sheer economic force. Soviet planners had studied Western markets and identified what they believed was capitalism's fatal weakness, the profit motive. Western companies needed margins to survive. Soviet factories didn't. They had the backing of the entire state apparatus, unlimited subsidies, and a single directive: capture market share at any cost. Satra Trading Corporation, an American import-export firm serving as distributor, launched the most aggressive marketing campaign the farming world had ever seen. They flooded Western agricultural publications with advertisements showcasing the MTZ-50's impressive specifications: 55 horsepower, robust construction, and that impossible price point that made every farmer stop and calculate. The MTZ-50 looked the part. Built like the industrial machinery that had helped the Soviets win World War II, it projected strength and durability. The wide stance, heavy steel construction, and purposeful design spoke to farmers who valued substance over style. This wasn't some delicate Western machine that might struggle in tough conditions. This was a workhorse built for the harsh realities of agricultural life. But the machine's Soviet origins created an immediate obstacle that planners in Moscow hadn't anticipated. Farm equipment dealers reported conversations where potential customers would examine the MTZ-50's specifications, calculate the savings, then walk away muttering about communist tractors. For some American and Canadian farmers, the MTZ-50's Soviet origins created an immediate ideological barrier. However, for others, the price advantage proved persuasive despite Cold War sentiment. Salesmen quickly learned to navigate this treacherous terrain. Reports from the time described dealers who would emphasize the tractor's technical specifications while carefully downplaying its communist origins. When reluctant customers hesitated, dealers would counsel that it's better to trade than to shoot. Yet the sales figures told a different story. Even in communities where political sentiment ran strongest against Soviet products, the Belarus tractors found buyers. Economic pressure has a way of eroding even the strongest convictions. Smaller operators, struggling with thin margins and rising equipment costs, found themselves reconsidering their principles. Family farms facing financial pressure couldn't afford the luxury of ideological purity when a Soviet tractor offered such compelling savings over its American equivalent. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Farmers who had initially dismissed Soviet equipment began asking dealers for hypothetical price comparisons. They studied the specifications more carefully, calculated potential savings, and slowly convinced themselves that purchasing decisions should be based on economics rather than politics. Soviet trade representatives understood this dynamic perfectly. They positioned their pricing strategy not as communist propaganda, but as simple business sense. Why pay double for the same capabilities? The Cold War might rage in diplomatic circles, but in the fields, mathematics would ultimately prevail over ideology. Soviet trade representatives traveled to farming communities across Europe and North America, armed with calculators and compelling mathematics. They showed farmers the numbers that seemed too good to be true. In North American markets, the MTZ-50 typically cost 15 to 20% less than Western alternatives, while in the UK and some European markets, the savings reached 35%. Some dealers claimed even greater discounts in specific situations. Operating costs were minimal. Return on investment was extraordinary. The economic theory behind this invasion was elegant in its simplicity. Flood Western markets with subsidized goods priced below production cost. Force Western manufacturers to compete against the entire Soviet treasury. Once market dominance was achieved, the West would become dependent on Soviet agricultural technology, economic conquest without firing a shot. By the mid-1970s, approximately 100 Soviet tractors were operating in Canada, with similar modest numbers appearing across Western markets. Farmers who had never considered foreign machinery found themselves placing orders for tractors from behind the Iron Curtain. The price advantage was simply too compelling to ignore. Why pay significantly more for a Western machine when this Soviet alternative offered the same capabilities at such a reduced cost? Soviet planners watched these initial sales figures with growing confidence. They had cracked the code of capitalist markets. Everything came down to price. Offer the lowest number, win the sale. The complexities of Western agricultural economics seemed to dissolve in the face of simple arithmetic. But this confidence revealed a fundamental misunderstanding that would prove catastrophic. The Soviets had confused the initial transaction with the total value proposition. They had mastered the art of making a sale, but completely misunderstood what it meant to serve a market. In the command economy, the relationship between producer and consumer ended at the point of purchase. Once the factory delivered the product, their responsibility was complete. The state would handle any problems that arose. But Western markets operated on an entirely different principle. The sale was just the beginning of a long-term relationship between manufacturer, dealer, and farmer. This fundamental disconnect would soon transform the Soviet Union's greatest strength into its most devastating weakness. Within the first year of operation, these machines told a different story than the sales brochures had promised. Across Western farms, the MTZ-50 tractors that had seemed like such incredible bargains began revealing their true nature. Oil leaks weren't occasional problems. They were constant companions. Hydraulic fluid pooled beneath every machine, creating environmental hazards and operational nightmares. The steering systems failed with alarming regularity. Farmers found themselves wrestling with tractors that wouldn't turn, couldn't hold a straight line, or simply stopped responding to input altogether. During the critical harvest window, when every hour of downtime meant lost income, these Soviet machines became expensive lawn ornaments. This was the accessibility paradox in its purest form. A tractor that cost substantially less but operated 0% of the time during harvest wasn't a bargain. It was a disaster. Western farmers discovered that the initial savings evaporated the moment something went wrong, and with Soviet tractors, something always went wrong. The real shock came when farmers tried to get their machines repaired. In the Soviet system, parts were allocated through central planning, distributed through state channels, and available when bureaucrats decided they should be available. This worked fine within the command economy where downtime was acceptable and efficiency was measured by production targets rather than profit margins. But Western agriculture operated on completely different principles. When a John Deere tractor broke down during harvest, the local dealer had parts in stock or could get them overnight. Service technicians understood the machines intimately because they had been trained by the manufacturer and supported ongoing relationships with farming customers. Soviet tractors came with none of this infrastructure. When an MTZ-50 needed a replacement hydraulic pump, farmers discovered they were dealing with a supply chain that stretched back to Minsk through Soviet bureaucracy and operated according to 5-year plans rather than harvest schedules. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Western manufacturers had spent decades building dealer networks, training service technicians, and creating parts distribution systems that could respond to farmer needs within hours. They understood that selling a tractor meant entering into a partnership that would last for decades. Soviet planners had completely missed this invisible infrastructure. They saw tractors as products to be manufactured and sold. Western companies understood tractors as platforms for ongoing relationships. The difference wasn't just philosophical, it was economic reality. Farmers who had been attracted by Soviet prices found themselves paying Western companies to fix their bargain tractors. Local mechanics, familiar with Western hydraulic systems and electrical components, could often jury-rig temporary solutions. But every repair required improvisation, every breakdown meant uncertainty, and every harvest season became a gamble. The testimonials from farmers painted a consistent picture. The MTZ-50 might work adequately when everything functioned properly, but agricultural machinery doesn't operate in ideal conditions. It faces mud, dust, extreme temperatures, and the relentless demands of seasonal work. Western tractors were designed and supported with these realities in mind. Soviet tractors were engineered for different priorities entirely. Built to meet production quotas in state factories, they reflected the values of a command economy: adequate performance under controlled conditions, with maintenance handled by state-employed mechanics using centrally allocated parts. The market delivered its verdict with ruthless efficiency. Farmers who had purchased Soviet tractors during the initial price-driven enthusiasm began trading them in for Western alternatives as soon as financially possible. The resale values plummeted as word spread through farming communities about reliability problems and parts availability issues. Within years, Soviet agricultural exports to Western markets had substantially declined. The initial sales surge based on price advantage had reversed into a reputation disaster. Farmers warned other farmers, dealers stopped stocking Soviet parts, and the entire experiment in economic warfare through subsidized pricing had backfired spectacularly. The lesson was harsh but clear. Markets don't just reward the lowest initial price. They reward total value over the entire life cycle of ownership. Reliability, service, parts availability, and ongoing support weren't luxuries that farmers could sacrifice for upfront savings. They were essential components of agricultural productivity. The 1975 agricultural trade statistics revealed one of the most stunning reversals in economic history. The Soviet Union, which had launched its tractor offensive with such confidence just 4 years earlier, found itself importing American agricultural machinery at an unprecedented scale. The numbers told a story that Soviet planners couldn't ignore. The United States sold $80 million worth of tractors and agricultural equipment to the USSR in 1975. Soviet exports to American markets totaled $900,000. The trade imbalance wasn't just significant. It was a 90-to-1 ratio that exposed the complete failure of the command economy's market conquest strategy. This wasn't simply a matter of consumer preference. Soviet collective farms, operating under the same state planning system that had produced the MTZ-50, desperately needed reliable machinery to meet their production targets. The irony was inescapable. The same government that had tried to flood Western markets with subsidized tractors was now purchasing Western tractors to keep their own agricultural system functioning. John Deere, International Harvester, and other American manufacturers found themselves in the surreal position of selling equipment to the very nation that had tried to destroy their market share. Soviet trade delegations, who had arrived in Western markets as conquerors, returned as customers, seeking the reliability and the support systems they had failed to provide their own farmers. The reversal revealed fundamental truths about how markets actually operate. The Soviet strategy had assumed that price was the only variable that mattered to customers. But farmers, whether in Iowa or Ukraine, needed machinery that worked consistently, could be repaired quickly, and was supported by knowledgeable technicians. Western manufacturers hadn't just built better tractors, they had built better systems. The dealer networks, parts distribution, training programs, and service relationships that Soviet planners had dismissed as capitalist inefficiencies turned out to be the decisive competitive advantages. Soviet collective farm managers facing the same productivity pressures as Western farmers made the same rational choice. They bought equipment from companies that could keep their machines running. The fact that these companies happened to be located in capitalist countries was less important than their ability to deliver operational reliability. The great economic weapon had become a symbol of systemic failure. Instead of conquering Western markets, Soviet agricultural exports had demonstrated the superiority of market-driven innovation and customer service. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, forced to purchase the very products they had tried to replace. The MTZ-50's failure revealed a deeper truth about economic competition. Free markets didn't win because they produced cheaper tractors. They won because they created systems of trust, reliability, and ongoing support that command economies couldn't replicate. Soviet planners could build machines, but they couldn't build the invisible networks of relationships that made those machines valuable to customers. This agricultural defeat revealed systemic weaknesses that would become increasingly evident throughout the command economy system. When central planning couldn't compete with market mechanisms in something as straightforward as tractor manufacturing, it signaled fundamental problems with the entire Soviet approach to international commerce. But what do you think? Do you think the MTZ-50 stood a chance at penetrating the market if the Soviets did something slightly different? Share your comments below.